This is an informational text or nonfiction passage, which means it is based on real, true things that happened. The title is My Story of Survival: How Millions of Jewish People Were Killed in the Holocaust. This is the story of one boy who lived. If you don't know what the Holocaust is, they will explain it on this first page. I want you to think about the word survival and how this is about one boy who lived, which means he survived. As you read, think about why is it important to hear stories like Sammy's today? Now, I can answer that question thinking I don't want history to repeat itself. The Holocaust is when a lot of people were killed and treated unfairly for the wrong reason. So I think it's important to read this so that that doesn't happen again. Let's see why. 7-year-old Sammy Harris clutched his father's hand. They were packed tightly into a crowd of people. It was 1942 in Sammy's village of Dublin, Poland. Now, when I see Poland, I need to know that on the map, that's way over here. So this is the world map. We live on this side. That's on this side. Sammy, his family, and nearly everyone they knew were being herded onto a train by German soldiers called Nazis. If you know what Nazis are, this story makes more sense. So Adolf Hitler was their leader. They wore these uniforms, and it was a German group. No one knew where they were going. So this is family, Sammy and his family. No one knew where they were going, but they knew they were being sent away because they were Jewish. As the crush of people edged forward, Sammy's father pushed him out of the crowd. Go, his father cried, pointing to a pile of bricks nearby. Run. Now I can tell that he is telling him to go hide. That's called an inference because he said the bricks, so I knew he was telling him to go hide over there, but I'm wondering why. Let's find out. Sammy ran and crouched behind the bricks. His sister Sarah, age 9, was already hiding there. It was the last Sammy would see of his parents and 3 of his siblings. They were among the 6 million Jewish people who were killed in a terrible chapter of history known as the Holocaust. So that's my definition of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jewish people were killed and Sammy survived. So this is the story of Sammy. The next one is called Shattered Peace. That's my subheading. I'm going to learn about how things were okay and peaceful, but it was shattered. Just 3 years earlier, Sammy's life had been peaceful and happy. But that changed in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II. So see, in 1942 over here, he was dealing with the war, and over here back in 1939. As German planes buzzed over Dublin, Sammy ran for his life. They were flying low, shooting at people, Sammy remembers, and then tanks rolled through town, shaking our little homes. Just imagine what that was like. It's a little boy going through that. The Nazi troops were carrying out the horrifying plan of German leader Adolf Hitler, which is the picture I showed you here. It's very important that you look ahead and look at all these text features. It helps you with the story. When he rose to power in 1933, Germany was struggling and its people were bitter and angry. Millions of German workers could not find a job. Hitler wrongly blamed Jewish people for causing the nation's problems. He gave them hateful speeches filled with lies to convince Germans that their Jewish neighbors were their enemies. Hitler set out to conquer all of Europe and eliminate its Jewish people. This is a photo of the Nazi soldiers forcing Jewish people out of a ghetto in Poland in 1943. Many of these people are thought to have died in concentration camps. Living in fear. Now my eyes go to this map first. So it's Europe 1942. That's when Nazis have taken over. The orange says they took over there. I do wonder why Switzerland was not affected. Tells me they were neutral. In the months after the Nazis invaded Poland, they took control in much of Europe and persecuted. Now because that word is yellow, I want to come back up here. And notice that persecuted means to treat someone cruelly or unfairly, usually because of religion, race, or political beliefs, which is unfair. So the Nazis persecuted Jewish people across the continent. They destroyed Jewish-owned stores and banned Jewish people from schools, restaurants, and many other public places. Dublin was one of the many towns and cities where Jewish people were forced to live in fenced-in, crowded areas called ghettos. They couldn't leave without permission and had almost nothing to eat. Sammy's family survived by smuggling in food from outside. Okay, so let me think about what I read. For a while, the Nazis had them living in certain little towns, little groups, little areas, and that wasn't good, but it gets worse. The Nazis later cleared out the ghettos, so those were called ghettos, but then the Nazis come through, and Sammy's parents and most of his siblings were among the millions of Jewish people who were then sent to prisons called concentration camps. So now I know when they talk about concentration camps, it's even worse. It's a prison. See the barbed wire? Many prisoners were killed on arrival. Countless others died from hunger or disease. Eventually, Sammy, Sarah, and their older sister Rosa ended up in a concentration camp that had been built in Dublin. As the oldest, Rosa did all she could to protect her younger siblings, and that's where you want to stop and empathize if you were the older sibling in that situation. Life was even worse than in the ghetto. The camp was infested with fleas and lice. Sammy and his sisters ate watery soup from a rusty can. If they were lucky, they got a tiny bit of horse meat. They lived in constant fear of being beaten or shot by the guards. All or none. In 1944, Sammy, Sarah, and Rosa were moved to a camp in the town of Chenstokhova. When new prisoners arrived at the camp, Nazi soldiers would separate them into two groups, people old enough to work and children. Okay, so now we're learning about what happened inside the camps. It's very important to stop and think about that. The older prisoners would be forced to make bullets for the Nazis, but children were useless to the Nazis and would soon be shot. As Rosa held his hand, 9-year-old Sammy stood on his tiptoes, straining to look taller. Think about why he's trying to look taller. It tells me that the older people, so maybe he was trying to look like an older person. But it was no use. While his sister sobbed, he was forced to go with those considered too young to work. Sammy and 4 others were locked in a building near the camp's main gate. The father of one of the children soon appeared with a letter from a Nazi leader that approved his daughter's release. The guard agreed to let the girl go, but insisted the other kids stay. Sammy says what happened next was a miracle. All 5 or none. So now I see why it's called that for the subheading. It's very important. The Jewish father shouted. He was risking his daughter's life and his own just to save 4 kids he didn't know. All or none. What you need to know about the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler didn't make the Holocaust happen alone. Millions of other people, Germans and non-Germans, also played a role. Some were actively involved, like soldiers and guards at concentration camps. Many more simply turned a blind eye to the suffering of Jewish people. Now, that doesn't mean they literally turned blind. That's figure of speech where they basically pretended they didn't see what was happening, and others were too afraid to speak up. With almost no help from the outside, Jewish people in several ghettos and concentration camps, the 2 words we learned about up here, you might want to reread that if you don't remember, bravely fought back, but they were outnumbered by the well-armed Nazis. Now, if the Nazis had them making those bullets, then I know that well-armed means they had a lot of weapons. On April 30th, 1945, as opposing troops closed in to capture Hitler, he killed himself. So he got out of being punished. Dozens of other Nazi leaders were captured and put on trial. Many were sentenced to death, while others spent years in prison. In this photo, it says these are some of the 7,000 prisoners who were freed from Auschwitz in Poland, the biggest Nazi concentration camp, in January 1945. More than 1 million prisoners died there. The Nazi guard shrugged. So this is back to the story, and I might need to recall. Remember that father said he needed to free all the children? Okay, the Nazi guard shrugged and released all the children. With that simple gesture, Sammy's life had been saved once more. As he and the others entered the camp, the adult prisoners cried tears of joy. They hadn't seen a Jewish child in years, Sammy explains. They kissed and hugged me. I will never forget this as long as I live. Finally free. I'm going to skip ahead to a word I need to know, prejudice. It's an unreasonable dislike or unjust behavior towards others based on the differences, such as religion, race, or nationality. I want you to ask yourself if you still see prejudice happen today. Finally free. Sammy and his sisters suffered for nearly a year in the camp. On January 17, 1945, almost exactly 75 years ago, Sammy watched the sky light up with red, pink, and white explosions. Now, it's not that they're throwing a party. Look at what happens next. There were bombs being dropped by the Soviet Union, one of the countries that had been fighting with Germany. So the Soviet Union came in to start a war in a good way against Germany to stop the Nazis. And so the Nazis fled the camp, leaving the gate wide open. All around Sammy, people cheered and cried. Though Sammy had only rags on his feet, he and his sister stepped through the gate to freedom. We began to dare to think of a new beginning, Sammy says. Okay, so think about it. They're now free. They're there in Europe. In May 1945, the Germans surrendered. By then, Sammy and Sarah were living in an orphanage. This is still in Europe. A few months later, they reunited with Rosa in Austria. That's incredible, a nearby country. But life wasn't easy. I want you to think about why there would still be problems. Well, there was still enormous prejudice against Jewish people in Europe. It became clear that Sammy and Sarah would have a better life in America. When Sammy was 12, he was adopted by a family in Illinois. Sarah lived with a different family nearby. Now, what's neat is here's Sammy with his sister now that they're in America back in 1948. And of course, this is Sammy today. Last section is called An American Teenager, the subheading. In many ways, Sammy was a typical American teenager. For example, he joined the Boy Scouts and played football and baseball. For years, he never spoke of the Holocaust because he wanted to forget. But as he grew older, he began to find the words to describe his experiences. Today, Sammy is 84 and lives near Chicago with his wife, Dee Dee. His daughter and grandchildren live nearby. He helped found the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. Sammy often gives speeches and interviews about his lost childhood. He says it never gets easier to talk about that painful, terrifying time, but he knows it's important to do so. I was saved, Sammy says. I had a good life. While 1.5 million Jewish children died, I owe it to them to share my story.